Hello, this lecture is entitled The Famous and the Nameless, The Lives and Afterlives of Chosun Martyrs. So the basic question I'm asking in this lecture is, how do Koreans today make sense of pre-modern Korean history? And I'm looking in particular at how Catholicism in Korean pre-modern history is remembered, particularly among Catholics, but also the kind of memory Catholics would like other non-Catholic Koreans to have. And I call this the Nameless and the Famous. One of the famous people we're going to look at is this man, St. Andrew Kim Dae-gun. And we're especially going to look at him and the celebration of his birth, which is associated with the geography of Solmoe, which is the village where he was born. And to show you how he's kind of an important person even to this day, Korean Catholics wanted him to be the UNESCO patron, and in fact he was selected for that. So you'll notice if you look closely at this, it says celebrated and associated with UNESCO the 200th anniversary of the birth of St. Andrew Kim Dae-gun, and he's talked about as a UNESCO patron, which I think is interesting. It shows the kind of desire to have an international connection. So that's the Famous. An example of the Nameless would be the attempt to establish Haemi Songji, the Haemi Soli site, on the UNESCO list of World Heritage Properties. And there is an attempt underway to do that in Korea. And what's interesting about that site is that there were, for the most part, no famous people executed there as Catholics. The closest is St. Andrew Kim Dae-gun's great-great-grandfather. Now, looking at this history has some awkwardness to it. That's one thing I think that makes it so interesting. So there's a kind of tension between the beliefs of persecuted Catholics and public secular values today, right? So when Koreans today are trying to look back at this and make sense of it and think, what does this mean for me? There's a certain awkwardness there because persecuted Catholics in 19th century Chosun Korea think differently from 21st century Korean Catholics and, of course, 21st century non-Korean or Korean non-Catholics especially. There's also a tension between nationalist goals of independence and the Catholic universalism, right? So you can kind of think about it this way. Who selects the leaders of Korean Buddhism? Korean Buddhists. Who selects the leaders of Korean Protestant churches? Korean Protestants. Who selects the leaders of the Korean Catholic Church? The Pope in Rome. There might be some consultation, but still, there is a slight difference there. And as we'll see in the 19th century, Catholicism could very easily be connected with and even implicated in Western imperialism. So there's some awkwardness there. So how does that kind of memory recalled? There's also tensions between the traditional values of Confucianism that Koreans might treasure today and Catholic views in the 19th century, where these values were relativized, were made subservient to Catholicism. And also, one thing we have to emphasize in 19th century Catholicism is the reality of martyrdom. Pretty much all famous historical sites, holy sites, however you want to refer to them, connected to 19th century Korean Catholicism are connected to a story of martyrdom, which is a story of Koreans killing Koreans for the most part, right? There were a few French priests who would be executed, but for the most part, this is Koreans killing Koreans. So there's that awkwardness. So, like I said, I had this basic question: how do contemporary Koreans, particularly Catholics, make sense of these tensions as they approach pre-modern Korean history? And we're going to be exploring this by looking at the Famous, i.e. Father Andrew Kim Dae-gun, especially Solmoe, and the Nameless, the martyrs of Haemi. I'm going to be asking this question: what is being remembered and how is it being remembered? And we'll see how Korean, especially Korean Catholics, are trying to apply this in a way that they hope will be relevant and useful to the current needs that they face. And you can kind of think about this as finding a so-called usable history. So we'll start with Andrew Kim Dae-gun, and I just want to note this just to show you kind of how popular he is among Korean Catholics in particular. This is a picture of a statue of him that I took in Duluth, Georgia. There is a kind of a Koreatown in Duluth, Georgia. There's a Korean Catholic church there, and we went down there to pick up some computer parts for my eldest son, and we went to Mass there, and of course they had a statue of Father Kim Dae-gun. But, of course, he was born in August 21st, 1821 in Solmoe, so that's why 2021 August was his bicentennial of his birthday. In 1836, he was baptized and selected to study for the priesthood abroad. That's moving pretty quick, going from baptism to studying for the priesthood. And one reason I wanted to point to this is his family, they had been Catholic. the persecutions made them, I don't know if lukewarm is the right way to say it, but they were not practicing their faith particularly diligently, in part because it was difficult to get access to a priest. But Kim Dae-gun's father would eventually kind of get back into the faith, and then would go visit Father Malbot when he came to visit Korea. And Father Kim would be baptized, or Andrew Kim, he's not father yet. Andrew Kim would be baptized at that point. So the key thing is he's like 15 before he's actually baptized. And that's striking, and just keep that in mind. That's going to be more important later on. In 1839, you had the Opium War, and that forced Andrew Kim Dae-gun in that year to move to the Philippines. He had been sent to Shanghai to study, but with the outbreak of the war, he had to go to the Philippines. And in that persecution, his father, Ignatius Kim, would be martyred, and his mother would be left destitute. She'd have to wander around and live off the charity of her fellow Catholics. So you can see already this kind of connection to imperialism, how it's impacting him. And you can really see that in the fact that in 1842, he will actually attend the ceremony for the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing, which ends that conflict. But he's going to travel a lot after that in Korea, and in order to try and find a safe way to bring priests into the country through a land route, that turns out to be really dangerous. And in 1845, after visiting Korea, he goes to Shanghai. He's ordained to the priesthood. And then 1846, because the land route was so dangerous, he was trying to find a sea route. He's going to be arrested and then is executed for treason. And while he's waiting to be executed, and then he's going to leave behind some writings, he also prepares a report describing the persecution of 1839. And it's interesting because Father Kim does give his own analysis of why these persecutions happen. Like I said, he in addition to those reports, he also writes some letters. And what's interesting is that if you look at a lot of the Confucian, the scholars and government officials who criticize Catholicism, they're always saying Korean Catholics are mubu, muju, no father, no king. He doesn't mention that idea. He doesn't see that as a cause of persecution. He doesn't even say much about ancestor rights, which of course is always a big thing. He is, though, critical of Korean religious practices. He does criticize them, but he's focusing more on kind of folk beliefs. So it's interesting, when he talks about causes of persecution, he doesn't point to any kind of real conflict with Confucianism or anything like that. Instead, he blames the cause of persecution on factionalism. Basically, there's a faction that's anti-Catholic, there's a faction that's willing to tolerate Catholicism. Whichever one is in charge, that's what determines whether we get persecuted or not. He doesn't go into really what makes a faction anti-Catholic or not. And then whenever one of the faction leaders that protects Catholicism dies, that leads to persecution. He, in particular, focuses on one Catholic, a man named Kim Yo-sam, who he calls the Judas, or that devil, who betrays the Catholics and goes and informs on them to the government. He sees that person in particular as a cause of persecution. He does, to a certain degree, recognize foreign connections, but he does that mostly indirectly. So, for example, when he's awaiting to be executed, he will write a letter. And in that letter to the French priest he's writing, he says, I heard a rumor that there's French ships. I hope they do something. If they do nothing and leave, they'll just kill us. Right? So there's this kind of sense that he's ambivalent a bit about it. I mean, it's not clear. Well, no, he's not even that ambivalent. He would really like it if the French used their military power to protect Catholics. And when he talks about the government officials, he presents them as either cruel, as mistaken, sometimes even sympathetic, but none really gives a clear explanation of why Catholics are being persecuted other than say it's the law or the king's command. But that's a little bit about how he understands the cause of persecution. And one thing that's interesting in this is about he is found to have a map among his letters, right? That and is found to have been sharing this map or intending to share this map with foreigners. And that is a cause of concern for the government. I'll talk about that later. But as he traveled about trying to find a route to get priests into the country, he needed to make a map of Korea, and he did that. And I just want to know, this is kind of a spoiler when this is from a webtoon about Father Kim. You'll notice that it emphasizes how he put Dokdo on the map, right? And so he's being presented as kind of an independence activist in a sense, right? Or someone trying to reclaim Korea's territorial sovereignty from any threat posed by foreigners. What's interesting, though, is how this map is discussed when there's a question, when they're talking with the king about how to punish Father Kim. And the king is very critical of sharing how Father Kim would share information about Chosun. He especially doesn't like the fact that he shared a map, and he says he wants the foundation of Catholicism in the country to be destroyed. He says we failed to do it in 1839. We need to come after the Catholics harder and in this threat posed by this religion. And there's a report submitted about Father Kim's interrogation. And what's interesting is it's basically a summary of points that Father Kim has made when he was being interrogated. And he emphasized that the French government was supporting the missionaries. He emphasized that those missionaries are going to keep coming whether the government likes it or not. He says that they're already doing that in Japan. And he also says that, the British were able to deal with a big country like China. How can a smaller country like Korea really be much of an issue? And there's this question about, what to do with him. And they actually come to consensus very quickly that they should kill him because they say he's using Catholicism to trick people and create internal problems while betraying his country by facilitating foreign invasion. So it's really interesting to kind of compare and contrast how Father Kim understood the cause of persecution. He doesn't really give a concrete cause other than to say, well, there are some people that don't like us, and that's pretty much it. Here you see, Catholics are a security threat, both domestically and in terms of foreign affairs, right? They're a threat on the outside and on the inside, so we need to deal with Father Kim and these Catholics. And this is an excerpt from Father Kim's last words, where he says, "My last hour has arrived. Please listen to what I have to say. I was in contact with foreigners because of my religion, because of my God. Now I will die for my God. Now my everlasting life will begin. All of you, if you want to be happy after you die, you should become Catholics. God will punish those who do not recognize him with eternal fire." So there's 2 points here. One is that he does kind of indirectly recognize the foreign concern that people had and how that could be a reason why they might want to come after Catholics. So that's one thing. He does kind of indirectly recognize that, and he wants to defend himself. He says, I wasn't trying to do this to encourage invasion or anything like that, even though I did say that it would be good if the French did something. It's actually because of my faith, and you should believe in that faith. And our second point is he implies that things will not go well for you if you don't believe in the Catholic faith, right? Like, he's not 100% clear, but there is an implication that if you don't believe in it, you do risk going to hell. So that's kind of an overview of Andrew Kim and his government in his time period. I now want to shift and look a little bit, and I think we've seen some of the awkwardness that can kind of come up with it. Now let's have a look at a little bit how Father Kim is being celebrated through his bicentennial of his birthday. So what's interesting, of course, is that here the international is not seen as a threat, right? In Chosun Dynasty, foreign countries are a threat, but here he's a source of international legitimacy, right? We want to connect his bicentennial to UNESCO, right? Celebrate in association with UNESCO. We're in a sense getting to if UNESCO recognizes a Korean as a great person, that makes Korea kind of a great nation. We have respect. That's great. And I think it's this is the YouTube page associated with the with this group that's kind of commemorating Kim Dae-gun. And it's really striking because you've got, first of all, up here, you've got him smiling with these children, but they really put them in the Chosun dynasty, right? They're all wearing hanbok. And you can see they have various videos. And this was really, it was kind of disrupted by COVID. So what ended up happening, a lot of this stuff, they weren't able to have in person, but they did make videos to kind of replicate the events. So to give you an example, there were concerts and cultural performances, right? So you've got a memorial performance here, and you can see they've got various sponsors down here. So it's not just the Catholic Church. This is something that other people are joining in on. You can see the government is in on this, for example. They also have a a YouTube video on that channel about how to make a Father Kim Dae-gun Lego figure, which I think is really cool. They also have a Minecraft recreation of Solmoe, his home village. So you've got like a villager here dressed up like a priest. You've got some instructions here, and then you can kind of explore this area. So they were really doing their best to make Father Kim this kind of relevant guy. They make a character in a font about him. So there's some writings of Andrew Kim Dae-gun in Korean, and based on those writings, they tried to make a font that would be like his writing. So you can have, you can type Korean in a word processor so that it will look like Father Kim's writing. There was also an effort to make characters, and there's actually like two different kinds of characters. There's like one where he's got kind of a big head like this, and then there's like the a more adult one. But I think it's interesting because a lot of these have to do with Catholicism. I like he's praying, but I also like how he's swimming. I think that's funny. I like how his bed looks like a dumpling, and there you can see he's a good Korean. He's studying. So you've got this attempts to kind of make him relevant. And one thing I want to look in particular is that they made like a children's storybook for very small children. They also made a webtoon that kids could enjoy, but older people could also enjoy. And it tries to retell his story. And I think it's fascinating because of how it kind of takes some creative decisions with the history of Korean Catholicism. But in this, they have Andrew Kim as a young boy seeing a slave being beaten by his neighbor, and then one of his family slaves comes and says, "Oh, they're looking. Your mom's looking for you." And then little Andrew Kim says, "I don't understand. If we're all people, why people in the upper class treat other people badly, and why do we treat upper class people kindly?" And his slave says, "Well, you need to go talk to your mom, and she'll be able to answer that question." And then she says, well, he asks a question and says, I saw a slave being beaten. I don't understand why he's being punished. And then she says, well, it's because they don't believe in God, right? That's why they do that. And then Andrew Kim says, well, what does that mean? What are you talking about? And then she explains, when God created the world, he became a human, and we're all his children, and we are all brothers and sisters. But there's a lot of people who don't understand that. And then she says, in the future, I want you to be a person who takes care of and heals those who are poor. And then he promises to do that. And I think this is really interesting for several reasons. One is that, like I said, he's like 7 here. His family wasn't, to my understanding, was not all that necessarily devout when he was 7. They're presented as being pretty wealthy. They weren't that wealthy, but that's how they're being presented. And it's interesting. These are certainly Catholic beliefs, and you do see some of this in Korean Catholicism. I don't see a lot of it with Father Kim necessarily. And of course, his goal, it's not that he as a Korean or as a Catholic, he was interested in caring for the poor, but we can see looking at what he actually wrote, he was mostly interested in the spread of Catholicism so people could go to heaven. Right? We saw that in his last words. But here that's kind of being shifted to emphasize Catholicism as a religion that cares for the poor, right? So here the emphasis is not so much, hey, we need to go out and make people Catholics, which is what Father Kim focused on a lot. Here the emphasis is we need to go out and do social justice work based on being good Catholics. So there's some creative liberties there, and this whole story about him and the slave is just made up. Like I've never seen that in any records. So then the story goes on that he sees another slave being beaten, and he actually intervenes and says, you should let him go. Don't treat him like that. And then they argue about God and Western learning. But the key thing is he's emphasized, Andrew Kim has presented, said, we need to treat everyone as being equal, right? And this is presented as what leads Father Kim, or Andrew Kim, I should say, and his family to have to leave is this incident. So basically the idea is that they're impoverished, they're forced to leave their home because of this, which is not true. And then this continues throughout the comic. So after he becomes a priest, he runs into this woman who is basically her son has died, and she's being forced to pay military tax on her dead son. And then he intervenes, gives her back the rice that's been taken from her, and then he talks about he kind of reflects on this, how we're supposed to be with people, how we're supposed to help them in their suffering, which of course is perfectly correct in Catholic doctrine, but that's again not so much what he was focusing on while he was alive. His focus was on how do I figure out how to get priests into Korea, and how do I save souls. And what's interesting here is, even though he didn't mention it himself, when they talk about the causes of persecution, they focus on ancestor rights, where Father Kim, basically what happens is his friends are happy because they get to eat the food from the memorial tablet for the Chainsaw. And he's like, well, my family doesn't do that. I wonder why. And he goes and asks his parents. And his dad says, well, we should respect our parents in other ways. We don't need to bow before food that they can't taste, right? And it's funny, too, to me, because it's kind of a false dichotomy. I mean, you can still, hold your parents dear in the bottom of your heart, as they say here, and perform ancestor rites. But in any case, that's how it's presented here. And he says, I believe this too, and I know this is why they killed our great-grandfather. So there's this emphasis here that the persecution is caused by the Catholic rejection of ancestor rites, which are presented as not really necessary, right? And it basically is kind of a critique, I think, of the Chosun dynasty in a sense that, why are they killing people over something like this? And you can also see this in how the officials are treated. When they talk about why Catholicism is bad, they don't mention so much no king, no father. What they focuses on is equality, right? There's this idea that our country, our system will be destroyed if we let these Catholics be active. And then he says, yes, those Catholics, they treat everyone equally, whether they're slaves or nobles, whether they're women or men. This is really bad. So the cause of persecution here is presented as the Catholic emphasis on equality, rejecting the hierarchy of Chosun, right? Which is a little bit different from what the Korean government, as we saw, it's not completely different, but it's kind of leaving out especially the foreign threat. And the way the foreign threat is kind of treated is interesting. Here you can see this very evil-looking official who says, this Kim Dae-gun's a traitor, we need to kill him. And so there's this interesting thing about when they discuss how to punish Kim Dae-gun. So in the historical records, the discussion about how to punish Kim Dae-gun does not take really much of any time. Everyone's just like, yeah, he needs to die, the king included. But here, there's this kind of story where an official who, look at his face, right? He looks like a very nice, kind man. He says, Kim Dae-gun was a bad guy, or he committed a crime, but he knows a lot about Western studies. He knows a lot about various languages. Therefore, we should give him a chance. Maybe we don't have to kill him, right? We can maybe figure out a way that he can live, and then he can share the knowledge. And it's implied then, in a sense, right, if we shared knowledge, if we gained access to Western knowledge, this would be good for the country. And if you follow this through, it's like, Korea could have become stronger earlier. It never would have been colonized. It never would have been divided. And it's interesting to hear because the king, rather than being upset by the map, is like, wow, this map is impressive, right? And there's this kind of idea that the map is sort of a good thing, right? Oh, is he translated everything here? And then here you see where the guy just says outright, this man knows what he's doing. If we let him live, that will help the country. So why don't we do that? So it's really striking, I think, there, right? And I want to stress, this is almost completely made up. Basically, in the records, there is a reference to one unnamed official in a Catholic source saying that, hey, this Andrew Kim Dae-gun guy is pretty smart. And they basically have made, and this isn't just here, you can see it in the Andrew Kim Dae-gun movie made by the Pyeonghwa Bangsong, see it lots of different places where they make this idea that Kim Dae-gun was, that there was a hesitancy to kill him because he knew so much about the West, and it's just not in the primary source documents. So, here, I want to stress they emphasize, they want to emphasize that he is he's being killed not because he is a foreign threat, but because he was in contact with foreigners for the good of theological studies and in order to conduct pastoral work, right? He's not a guy trying to bring an invasion, right? So while they don't recognize directly that Andrew Kim Dae-gun was kind of a foreign threat from the point of view of Chosun, here it does say, oh, and by the way, he wasn't really up to anything bad. He was just trying to learn to be a priest and be engaged in pastoral activities. And, if Chosun was a modern country, they would have been fine with that. And that's really a human right anyway. So it's not his fault. And then they talk about him being executed, right? And what's striking then is that rather than give his last words, a selection from one of the letters that Andrew Kim Dae-gun wrote is given. And one of his last letters was actually like a circular letter to the Korean Catholic community. And in that letter, he says he says this on the following. This is the original, and then this is the translation. And what's interesting about this, right? If we skip this top part, let's just go down here. He focuses on how this is a difficult world we live in, how there's a lot of suffering and pain, and we really need to believe in God and trust in the church and its sacraments so we can go to heaven after we die. But they quoted just this part here in bold, right? And it says, God from the beginning disposed all things, created us human in his image. Let us consider his aim and intention in setting us in this world. And if you only quote that part, what it makes is, it seems as Catholicism isn't so much a religion simply about, getting a good afterlife. It's a religion that gives you meaning in this life, right? So that's going to be a little bit more palatable than saying, oh yeah, you should believe this religion or you may go to hell, which is what Father Andrew Kim apparently said before he died. Here it says you should believe in this religion because it gives meaning to your life, right? And God made you and loves you, and it leaves out that kind of otherworldly aspect. So it's they're quoting a primary source. I mean, and it does say what it says, but they've kind of taken out the context. And the comic really ends with a celebration of international fame, right? With the father taking his family to Solmoe and then saying, now the shrine of Solmoe has become a well-known holy site all around the world, and everyone now knows Korea. And you can see here, I especially like this image because it shows how there's this kind of overlapping secular and Catholic international recognition of Father Kim. And you can see that here because you've got a UNESCO site, right? Celebrating UNESCO's anniversary or recognition of the anniversary. You also see a statue of the Pope, Pope Francis, when he visited Solmoe, and there's him sitting down to pray at his house, and Father Kim's reconstruction of his house. And I think that's really striking. So that's the famous. Let's now move to the nameless, right? Let's move to the nameless. So the Haemi Martyr Shrine Memorial, which is a really beautiful place. We'll talk more about that. But before we do that, let's talk just briefly about what Haemi was. So Haemi was a special place under military jurisdiction. Now, what does that mean? Traditionally in Korea, the monarch had to give permission before someone could be executed. So you could pass sentence on someone to die, like a governor could do that. But they were supposed to then get permission from the king before they actually killed anyone. So that's a special prerogative of the king. But under military jurisdiction, there was a kind of an exception. You didn't have to wait to get permission because for security reasons, you may have to kill people right away. You were supposed to go ahead. You could execute someone, but then you were supposed to report it later, right? So you could kill first and then send the report rather than sending the report and then doing the execution. Now, here's the thing. This does not seem that these cases were always reported. I mean, you already killed someone, king's busy. Why bother him? It's extra paperwork. So they didn't always follow through on this. They might go ahead and execute someone, but then never bother to inform the king. And the thing is, Haemi as a military region overlaps with Napo, which was an important center for early Catholicism. Right. So basically what this means is that a lot of Catholics, where Catholicism is growing, especially in the early part of its history, is going to be in an area where the government can take action and kill people without necessarily leaving a record. So what that means is there are a lot of unnamed martyrs from Haemi. Right? There are a lot of martyrs. There seems to be a good amount of evidence of people being killed here who were Catholic, and but their names are unknown. And just to give you a sense of the area we're talking about, this is the kind of Napo/Haemi region, and you can see here this is a Catholic map of it that gives you a sense of where they're at. Now, I do want to note there are some named martyrs. The great-grandfather of Andrew Kim Dae-gun, Pius Kim Jin-hoo, he was a martyr there. But for the most part, Korean church claims from hundreds to thousands of people martyred here. We only know the names really of 3. And there you can see that this is a statue at the Haemi Holy Shrine, and then this inside is their portraits. And one thing about this area, Haemi and Napo, is that there is a connection between it and the Oppert expedition. And if you're not familiar with this, basically Oppert was a Prussian adventurer who wanted to figure out a way to make some money and also end the persecution of Catholicism to boot. So he approached a French Catholic priest who had been active in Korea and got financing from a American businessman in Shanghai, a man named Frederick Jenkins. I wrote an article on him, and he's from South Carolina, which of course is where I'm talking to you from. And they hatched this plan to steal the bones of the king's grandfather, King Gojong, and then hold them for ransom to force the Korean government to stop killing Catholics and to open up for trade. And what happened is they would get to the tomb, right? Oppert and his men would get to the tomb, and they would not be able to actually open the tomb, and they would be forced to leave, right? And there's the tomb right there. And I just want to include this a little bit about what was going on there. So this is something that is commemorated in Korea. This is something Koreans, if they visit, they're going to be reminded of this incident. And I thought that here's a modern day comic of this incident. And one thing we want to stress is that, a French priest was part of this. Korean Catholics helped guide the expedition. So here you can see there's this kind of popular monument dedicated to this, but also, and it talks about this thing that's really bad from any perspective, but especially if you're a Korean nationalist, this is really bad, but especially bad because Catholics are implicated from it. And here you can see this is some of the grounds of Haemi, and here you can see a stone that marks where Korean Catholic prisoners were thrown down into a pond where they would drown. And here you can see that the pond reconstructed with a statue of a Catholic there in it, or Catholics there in it. And here you can see like a modern day rendition of them being thrown in the pond. And the big deal about why I'm talking about the Oppert expedition, of course, is because when this expedition occurred, that led to a resurgence in anti-Catholic persecution, and a whole bunch of Catholics were killed here, right? Especially because they didn't have to go through the normal judiciary hoops, right? They didn't have to go through all the normal practices. They could just kill them as they found them and not have to worry about reporting to the king or anything like that. And here's some relics. These are the remains of Catholics that are enshrined at Haemi Songji. And here you can see a tomb that has some of their relics as well. And the grounds of Haemi Holy Site, I think, are pretty impressive. This is a picture I took. I was able to go to Professor Lee-Hyun Bum. Was kind enough to take a group of us to go visit the shrine. There is Pierre, who I think is in the audience. Hello, Pierre. But it's a pretty impressive, I think, edifice. There's a gate that you can enter. There are two gates, I guess. And then here is this tower, which we'll talk about later. And we went in the fall, and you can see the foliage is quite beautiful. When we went, there were people there who were not there apparently for spiritual reasons. They were there to take pictures of the beautiful trees and enjoy the grounds, which are very well taken care of. And there again, you can see this is where a lot of the pictures I took with the images, the enshrined relics. And then you can also go up this tower. And this is the image from the tower. You can see, again, it's quite beautiful. This is meant to look like a tomb. And then these are later I'll talk about some stations of the cross that they have here. But you can see it's a very nice, well taken care of area. And here you can see from this sign the grounds. Again, you can see how it's all laid out. And once again, there are the stations of the cross right there. And they also celebrate the fact that the Pope came. Right, the Pope is going to visit here in 2014. And it's kind of interesting that the Pope would visit because, like I said, this is a place of nameless martyrs, right? Why would you go to a place of nameless martyrs? And I think it's really striking here because you have a group of Korean Catholics being led off to be executed here at Haemi Shrine, and then you have Jesus and what appears like it's not quite Hanbok, but it's not that different with them, right? So you had this interesting kind of parallel and this kind of overlapping of holy time and regular time, I suppose you could say. And you can especially see that with the Stations of the Cross. So if you're not familiar with the Stations of the Cross, basically if you go into Catholic Church and you look on the walls, there will be, usually they're wooden plaques, or they're supposed to have some kind of wood on them, but they're plaques that have 14, and there's 14 of them, and each one marks a different part of the death of Jesus. So there'll be a part where he's whipped, there's like 3 parts where he falls, there's a part where he's nailed to the cross, there's a part where he finally dies. And they mark the Stations of the Cross, and they have them, right? This is a close-up, and it's kind of a Jesus that looks Korean, but they've got the kind of traditional, this is where Jesus is crucified. But on the other side, right, they have a description of what happened to the martyrs. So again, they're trying to draw this connection between their own martyrs and to Jesus himself. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the shrine, these attempts to kind of connect our time to this kind of, to Chosun, to a holy religious time. But again, it's interesting because it's being done with people who are essentially nameless, right? It's kind of curious. Why make such a big deal about a place where these Catholics died and we don't know who they are, when there's plenty of places where Catholics died and we do know who they are? And actually, that's what basically worked for a long time. Initially, it did not receive much attention. Initially, people did not pay much attention to this shrine. It just didn't seem like necessarily that much of a big deal. But especially in the 1980s, it received new attention. And in part, that's because that's when you've got the 103 Korean, or saints of Korea. I shouldn't say Korean saints, because I believe 10 of them were French priests. But there's a new focus on this area, because in a sense, okay, we got the 103 saints of Korea canonized. Where do we go from here? Right? We can't just stop. We want to go out and get more people canonized. And so this area receives more attention, and there's increase in development of the site. And then in 2014, Pope Francis visits, right? And that's important. And like I say, it's interesting that he would visit essentially a shrine of mostly nameless people. And in March 2021, it was recognized by the Vatican as an international pilgrimage site, which again is really interesting. So why would it receive this attention, right? Why do we want to focus on this kind of out-of-the-way shrine that has a bunch of people who no one knows about? And this question was brought to Father Han Kwang-sok, who is in charge, at least in 2021, I think he still is in charge of the Haemi Songji, that complex. And he was asked the same question: why should we pay attention here? And this is key, right? This is key to, I think, how these Korean Catholics are wanting to remember their past and want to present it to other people. And it's interesting because he says, you know what? It is kind of odd that it's being remembered because it is different from other international sites. So, for example, he says, Jerusalem, that's where Jesus lives. So, of course, we should recognize that as an international Catholic site. Rome, that's where the popes are, right? And that's where Peter and Paul built up the church. So we should recognize that. Assisi, yeah, St. Francis, great man, great saint. We should remember that. And, of course, the various Marian sites, any place that the Virgin Mary appears that's recognized by the church as worthy of belief. We should totally recognize that. And it's exactly, though, because our place is a place of nameless people that we should remember. It's precisely because it's different that we should remember it. He says it's special because people from the lower classes could, through faith, be known by God and thereby have precious names. So the idea here is we're affirming through this site that everyone, even people who no one knows about because they were so low, even they are important to God. Right, so it's this kind of testament to human dignity, and that goes in really well with an understanding of why persecutions happened. Right, this idea that Catholics were persecuted because they emphasized equality, and going along with that equality is this idea that we all share a kind of equal human dignity. And that was an interview he had with Pyeonghwa Bangsong, the Catholic Broadcasting, but he was also interviewed by and I'm sorry, that's Father Han Kwang-sok there in the middle. He was also interviewed by secular KBS. And there he said, people are equal, they have human rights. That was not something recognized by the Chosun state. So here, Korean Catholicism, rather than being like this kind of otherworldly religion, where people just want to go to heaven, here there's this idea, no, Korean Catholics, they were persecuted not because they were a foreign threat, not because they believed odd things religiously that were a threat. They were persecuted because they believed in human rights, that they believed in human equality. And what's interesting is that after talking with Father Han, the interviewer said how much he admired these people because despite their suffering, they had kept their faith, and that made them great. And it's interesting, right? Because I don't think the interviewer is Catholic, right? But he is saying, the fact that they were sincere, that they were authentic, even though they suffered, that's something that's great, right? And that's something that's palatable, something that people, even if they're not Catholic, can kind of respect, right? We respect people that suffer for their beliefs. Even if we don't necessarily share those beliefs, there's some respect that they're sincere. And when you think about all this stuff is very democratic, right? It's very modern. This ideas of equality, that lower people matter, that they're important. And it goes in with a lot of the politics of the Korean Catholic Church. And we can see this if we look also at how they develop Haemi, how the kind of goals for the area. So their Father Han, in a kind of joint interview that included secular figures, including the mayor of the local town, he would say that he wanted the shrine complex to expand and then link up with other historical and cultural sites to make kind of a route. And what's interesting too was that he wanted specifically to link up with Buddhist holy sites, which I think is really striking that he would want to do that as well, which is something that Father Kim might have found a little curious. And he was supported by the mayor of the local town, Meng Jong-ho, who would say, with the government support for building up the infrastructure, would make the holy site a place of healing and reconciliation, life and peace that can be enjoyed by all people in the world. So Catholicism, rather than just being kind of this insular group focused on the next world, is going to be a place of this worldly, kind of a source where this worldly goods will flow from. And I thought that was really striking. And of course, there's this idea of that this will help make this into a tourist area and make money, right? That will help the local community. And it's interesting because there is an effort to have Haemi declared to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which I think is really interesting. So a few conclusions, right? So the history of pre-modern Korea and Korean Catholicism, the interrelationship between them can be quite awkward, right? We talked about that, right? That the Catholicism could be seen as a foreign threat. Catholics didn't necessarily have values that would gel with today's population, especially the non-Catholic population. You have this awkwardness of Koreans killing Koreans. So there's a lot of awkwardness there. But through Father Kim and the Nameless Haemi martyrs, this awkwardness is transformed into something that at least the people who created these narratives hope will be positive, right? Korean Catholics have gone from being potential subversives with uncomfortable beliefs to contributors to democracy and a just society, contributors to human rights. They've gone from bringing foreign threats to bringing foreign benefits, right? Catholicism, its foreign connections are no longer a threat. They're no longer a danger. In fact, they can lead to the elevation of Korea's respect and prestige on a world stage. And therefore, Korea and Korean Catholicism in particular is something that Koreans can be proud of on an international stage. So rather than being a source of awkwardness, of discomfort, wow, Catholicism in Korea, it's where it's at, right? It's a source of democracy, of equality, of respect and prestige for our country, right? That's the basic narrative. How much people accept this narrative, I'm not sure, but it is certainly a narrative that is out there and is being shared widely and loudly, in a sense, by Korean Catholics.